Towards the end of March, there was a quiet end to a long chapter of aviation in the Asia Pacific, specifically Delta's presence at Tokyo-Narita Airport, as it shifted its base of operations in the Tokyo area from Narita to Haneda Airport near downtown Tokyo. While the transfer was quiet and unceremonious for the most part, the build-up to this move was taking place over a span of years as the decline of Narita as a hub for the airline, along with the changing landscape of trans-Pacific travel, contributed to the decision of Delta, which acquired the rights to flights at Tokyo-Narita through the Delta Northwest merger in 2008. While it marks an end to a great chapter in its aviation history, Delta and its predecessor Northwest have contributed greatly to the trans-Pacific aviation scene, and with the presence at Tokyo-Narita, one could have taken it as a Japanese airline. When we take a look at the history of Delta's presence at Tokyo's Narita Airport, we have to look at the history of Northwest, its predecessor, on those services and routes. Within years of its founding in 1926, the Minneapolis-based airline was already experimenting with trans-Pacific flights as early as the 1930s, and it did so by sponsoring the efforts of Charles Lindbergh, whose claim to fame was being the first pilot to travel solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Northwest sponsored the efforts of Lindbergh and his wife for test flights between the United States and Japan at the time via Alaska. This involvement and experimentation in trans-Pacific flights would continue as Northwest was a government contractor on flights between the US and Alaska, gaining the experience of transiting across the North Pacific, and during the aftermath of World War II, Northwest was granted the rights by the US government for flights across the North Pacific. Far from the days of modern aviation, there wasn't much players besides the likes of Pan Am when it came to trans-Pacific travel, which for the most part would depart the US to Hawaii before arriving at the Asia hub at the time of the Philippines for these flights. Combined with the lessons of Lindbergh's test flights over the North Pacific and the airline's experiences during and after World War II, Northwest would lead the formation of a new route to transit the Pacific, and in turn laying the foundation for Tokyo to become a premier hub of trans-Pacific travel. In the aftermath of World War II, Tokyo was very much destroyed after it faced heavy bombardment from US bombers, and during the rebuilding process there wasn't a Japanese airline of the likes of ANA and JAL that we see today. Airlines like Northwest was already looking for opportunities in the area. While Northwest was building its domestic network in the US, the opportunity in Japan led to the formation of Northwest Orient, a brand under the airline dedicated for trans-Pacific flights, using Japan as its primary gateway to the region. The first flights took off from Minneapolis on July 15, 1947, making stops in Edmonton, Canada and Anchorage, Alaska before touching down at Tokyo Haneda. With a base of Tokyo, the airline would open up new routes to the cities of Manila, Shanghai, Seoul, and Okinawa. Within the first few years of the opening of the Tokyo base, and following the Chinese Revolution and Civil War, Shanghai was dropped from the network in favor of Taipei, Taiwan. Being the first mover, Northwest gained an even better advantage with a treaty between the US and Japan in 1952, which secured Northwest's standing in trans-Pacific travel, with Pan American being its other competitor. Northwest would also serve as a primary government contractor for flights within the region, including a stint of serving military flights between Japan and Korea during the Korean War. While not a Japanese-owned airline, it actually became one of Japan's mainstay airlines, though Northwest would have a hand in one of the most important events in Japanese aviation history. While Allied forces made the call in the occupied Japan in the late 1940s and into 1952, efforts were made to start a new company as an airline, with several airlines from the Allied powers as major stakeholders in the company, including Northwest. The airline would become known as the Japan Domestic Air Corporation, which started off operating domestic flights out of Tokyo, with Northwest providing flight crew and pilot training, and later on that airline would purchase a DC-4 from Northwest. With the support of the foreign airlines, along with Northwest would eventually see the newly formed airline became what we now know today as Japan Airlines, the first and national airline of Japan. While Japan Airlines would continue to grow, so too would the Japanese economy, and Northwest was a beneficiary of this growth, as it began to connect Tokyo to other cities in the US such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York via Anchorage, Alaska, using newly acquired DC-8 aircraft. For most of the first 2 decades of its presence in Tokyo, Northwest's hub was at Tokyo-Haneda, which would change in 1972 when Tokyo-Narita was opened and the Japanese government shifted international air travel to that airport, paving way for the start of Northwest's golden era in the 1980s and 1990s, which saw a lot of Boeing 747 and large aircraft by Northwest operating out of Narita. If you happen to have traveled in Narita in the 1980s and the 1990s and well into the 2000s, with the large presence of Northwest aircraft at the airport, you could easily mistake it for one of its North American hubs. Along with Pan Am, Northwest's strategy at Narita was having travelers from North America connecting in Tokyo to its intra-Asia network to cities such as Bangkok, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the U.S. territory of Guam, providing a link for tourists from Japan to the U.S. territory, not to mention the non-stop air link for vacationers heading to Honolulu, Hawaii. While it continued to grow, the Trans-Pacific travel scene was changing with Pan Am's slots at Narita taken over by United, and eventually the skies would eventually be deregulated, paving the way for airlines such as Delta to start their own Trans-Pacific competing services. Still, the dominant players in Japan in terms of the U.S. carriers were both United and Northwest, which further expanded its reach in the U.S. territories in the Pacific with new flights to Saipan in the late 1980s. Further expanding its presence in Japan, the airline would eventually even start developing routes from other Japanese hubs such as Osaka, Nagoya, and Fukuoka, with an example of this being routes from Detroit to Manila via Nagoya, along with flights from Tokyo to both Osaka and Nagoya. And with China opening up to the outside world, Northwest would launch flights from Japan to cities in China such as Beijing and Shanghai. With various Fifth Freedom flight rights and the variety of Trans-Pacific flights, Northwest's strategy was very much providing North American travelers connecting options to Asia via Tokyo, and combining that traffic with Japanese travelers, some of whom were vacationing on some cities such as Guam and Saipan or Honolulu. And for many years that strategy worked, though market forces would eventually force the changes and a reduction and an ultimate decline of the Narita hub. Like many of its Asian counterparts, Japan was impacted by the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, and Japan was not considered as an economic powerhouse as it was before. New fuel-efficient and modern aircraft such as the Boeing 777s paved the way for airlines such as Northwest and other competing airlines from both sides of the Pacific to open up new non-stop flights between cities in the United States and North America to China, Japan, and Korea, reducing the need to connect in places to cities like Tokyo. Along with an increased variety of choices, airlines began forming partnerships in the form of codeshare partnerships, and for most of the major airlines forming into airline alliances, which Northwest joined along into SkyTeam. And airlines such as Northwest began to shift some of its traffic to these codeshare flights. As Northwest was continuing its operations in Tokyo, it was announced that Northwest would be merging with Delta Airlines, the Atlanta-based company, and eventually the iconic red tails with the Northwest logo would change to Delta at airports such as Narita, where by then had support facilities with staff based at the airport. As acquisitions and mergers were ongoing, the aviation landscape was a turf war of alliances and partnerships, and a newly merged airline was looking for a Japanese airline to secure a partnership with. And the carrier saw an opportunity in the late 2000s, 2009, when Japan Airlines was struggling with its bankruptcy issues. Delta did offer to buy a stake in the Tokyo-based airline, though eventually Japan Airlines would spurn Delta in favor of its one-world partner American Airlines. The problems only added further with United announcing the joint venture with All Nippon Airways, Japan Airlines' main rival, and other competitors in the Japan domestic scene such as Skymark Met would either cease operation or would be merged to a larger company to bigger operations. With ANA and Japan Airlines adding to their international network, especially to Asia, Delta was the odd man out in terms of partnerships in Japan. During the 2010s, Delta would continue to operate its Narita hub amid the growing competition of the joint ventures, plus the growth of airline routes and flights from the Asian-based carriers. And things would only get more competitive with the opening up of new flight slots for international airline routes from Tokyo Haneda after nearly 3 decades of being primarily just for domestic flights. Delta would use the opportunity of its newly acquired slots at Haneda in 2010, opening up new flights to Detroit and Los Angeles in February of 2011, which looking back would be the start of Delta beginning its phasing out of its Narita hub. And by the time it acquired new flight slots at Haneda in 2019, Delta would announce it would formally shift its operational base in Tokyo from Narita to Haneda, shifting much of its North American flights from Tokyo to Haneda and shifting its remaining intra-Asia services to Manila from Seoul, which Delta is now using as its Trans-Pacific hub thanks to its joint venture with Korean Air. Delta's predecessor Northwest succeeded in the early part of this venture in Tokyo, being the first mover, though times have now changed and the aviation landscape has evolved, where now the preferred option of travel is a shorter option or a non-stop in most cases. And this is offered by a countless number of airlines now, from major cities in the US to Asia using 787 or A350 aircraft, which today has replaced the 747s and the DC-10s once used by airlines such as Northwest. While still an economic power in Asia, there simply wasn't that much competitive options for Delta, given its lack of partners in Japan, which is most often the main reason cited as the reason for Delta's decline and ultimate withdrawal from Tokyo-Narita, its motivation for its joint venture with Korean Air, and the shift of its Trans-Pacific flights to Tokyo utilizing Haneda Airport. As I continued to do more research into this video, I did find some other potential factors which could have contributed to the decision, which deals with the cost of operating at Tokyo-Narita, which some airline executives have been quoted in saying that Japanese airports have some of the highest landing fees and fuel costs around the world. This has been a long-standing problem for Delta, with its predecessor Northwest facing the same issues, and without the needed traffic for the viability of the route as it had before, it probably ate away at the revenues that Delta and Northwest would have earned leading up to its decisions of phasing out much of its flights out of Narita. This leads to the second point of having a foreign base at Tokyo of the scale which Northwest and later Delta was operating. While it was a major player in the Japanese aviation scene, Northwest and Delta was always seen as a foreign airline, and flight slot allocation would usually favor the Japanese carriers. These costs and being a foreign airline further added into the costs of operating for Delta in an overseas base. The airline would have likely seen added costs in rotating aircraft between Japan and the US mainland, whether for maintenance or to meet weaker or stronger demand in certain markets, while airlines such as JAL and All Nippon Airways could respond quicker as their aircraft are based in Japan. These costs could also extend to flight crew and pilot basing, where costs could add up from Delta abiding by contracts between staff and pilots when it comes to overseas travel, especially on the intra-Asia routes. This could be a reason why Delta has been gradually shifting its Asia base in North America to the city of Seattle, where Delta has a base for domestic flights to support its Trans-Pacific routes from the US Pacific Northwest to key cities such as Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, and Beijing, and a planned route between Seattle and Osaka, which has been shelved for the time being. For many who have traveled the Pacific with Northwest and Delta, the topic will likely bring nostalgia of a golden era that was, and few people will actually know about the contributions to the Japanese aviation, thanks in part to Northwest Airlines at a time Japan rose as an economic power in the aftermath of World War II. As Tokyo's aviation scene has evolved, so too has Delta's strategy in the Pacific, as it focuses its Trans-Pacific hub in Korea and to an extent in Seattle. I definitely hope you enjoyed this video, and if you happen to have memories as a traveler with Northwest or Delta, especially if you happen to be a crew member from the past or present who have anything to share about the memories of Tokyo-Narita, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. In the meantime, this has been another edition of Flights in Asia, highlighting the news and updates from the aviation and travel scene in the Asia Pacific. If you like this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Once again, thank you for watching and have a great day.